All right, so hi everybody, welcome, and thanks for taking this time. I'm going to start off with giving a little introduction to John and Thomas. For this call, is it Tom or Thomas? Tom?
All is good. Tom, Thomas, Tommy, all permutations of the name Flyhu.
All right. Okay, we'll mix and match it, and I'll probably usually call you Tom. And I made these introductions up. I'll give you a chance to correct them when I'm done. But John Kesler is an attorney by trade who has focused his public service work on a deep exploration of civility and maturity in political, cultural, and global contexts, using adult development theory to craft leading-edge approaches to community flourishing. He's also had pivotal roles in reform movements in healthcare, education, leadership theory, and non-ideological politics. John is an ordained bishop in the Mormon Church and has worked on the innovative periphery of the Mormon community, integrating traditional religious values with principles from perennial spirituality, transpersonal development, and integral theory. He's one of the few people who has been certified by Genpo Roshi to lead the Big Mind process and was one of the founding members of the Integral Spirituality Center with Ken Wilber. And finally, and most importantly, John has extended the Big Mind process, adding elements from polarity theory and developmental theory to create integral polarity practice, which you might hear us call IPP on this call. And we'll be discussing that today. So thanks for being here, John. It's impossible to do justice to all of your accomplishments and your service projects in a short space. It's quite an impressive list. And we can just invite people to go to johnkesler.com for more information.
Tom.
Do you want to add any of that before I introduce Tom?
I don't want to add a thing.
Great. So Tommy McConkie is a teacher, author, and coach of mindfulness and adult development, working in several contexts, including transformative workshops, youth empowerment, and contemplative practices within the greater Mormon community. He's immersed himself in deep engagements with a number of contemplative traditions, including Zen and Vipassana in the US and abroad. Tom's author of a book titled Navigating the Mormon Faith Crisis, a simple developmental map, which I recommended to many people as the clearest available introduction to adult developmental theory. And it's applicable to everyone, despite its title. Tom produces a really terrific podcast called Mindfulness Plus, where he, I love this, I took it from his website, offers a few drops of wisdom, lyrical teachings, and guided meditation with a trademark voice that can soothe the savage beast. And I think that's so true, Tom. I've always appreciated how you integrate high wisdom with down-to-earth humility and humor when you lead things. And it may be that style that's drawn so many to the Salt Lake City area and beyond to your work, and where you and your partner Gloria have created the Lower Light School of Wisdom, which is, and I'm quoting again from the website, dedicated to reimagining faith and human transformation in the 21st century. What do you think to that?
Very generous introduction, Tom. Thank you.
I'd add one thing, and that is Tom is the first IPP successor in terms of my teaching. And the
yes, good. Yes,
John,
good.
John has knighted me.
Yes. Yeah, I was actually going to say that next. Good. I was going to say that I think that Tom's the only person certified to teach IPP, and that is still the case, huh? Yeah. So now IPP has a very close relationship with the stages developmental model created by Terrell Fallon. And the conversation we're going to have today has been scheduled as a component of a special issue of the Integral Review Journal that's going to be focused on the stages model. So we also have with us Trish Nowland joining us on the call. She's an integrally informed academic and practice explorer in the integral community, and she's joining us from Sydney. And Trish and I both have studied IPP in various forms with John and Tom during the last decade. And Trish has graciously volunteered to write a summary and a reflection of this audio conversation to appear as sort of a written component in that journal special issue. Trish, do you want to add anything to say who you are, what brings you here?
No, that more than covered everything. Thank you so much, Tom.
Okay. All right. So yeah, Trish and I have talked about kind of just some guiding questions for our conversation. First, I just want to ask if there's anything from that kind of world of introductions that comes to mind that you guys want to add to kind of frame the whole conversation before we dive in.
I don't think so,
Yeah.
from my perspective.
Okay. Well, and yeah, so we'll be tag teaming between the two of you guys, and you'll just jump in as you do, of course. But I want to start off with just giving the listeners a short introduction to what integral polarity practice is. So do you want to just start us off that way, John?
Sure. Well, integral polarity practice is significantly grounded in polarities, and it works with stages of development and states and many different elements that one would associate with integral. There are a lot of components to it, but overall and simply, what it's intended to do is try to help a person create a peaceful center and be well integrated, and to be able to access their deepest wisdom and compassion and insight and creativity to lead a healthy life, a resilient life, and a contributing life.
Great.
I would say that it's not intended to be an inclusive path. It's a practice that I hope can be a helpful complement to any tradition, or in combination with other approaches to practice and life work.
Can I make a comment on that?
I'm hoping you'll add to that, Tom.
I'm seeing smiles, so that I'll take that as a yes. I can comment on that. Another way of saying that IPP is intended to be complementary to any tradition that a given person brings to the practice of IPP is that it represents a meta-lineage framework, meaning that we all come from some place in terms of lineage, ancestry, tradition, and our tradition will naturally help cultivate certain aspects of virtue and capacity within a human life. What we found in our practice community with IPP is that it makes visible the possible virtues, capacity, stages of development, etc., across traditions. So it serves as a very rich framework and matrix for helping us better appreciate what specific gifts different traditions are especially able to cultivate. Right? So just on a practical level, it's been rich for us to use IPP as a framework to help weave different lineages together in a practice space, in a community, in a kind of meta-lineage context.
It's occurring to me to add that it is a fairly comprehensive map of the territory it's looking at, and it's got a lot of overlap with integral theory and the developmental models that a lot of us are familiar with. But one thing that it does contain, there's two things that kind of make it stick out in my mind. One is that it's a map that can be used for developmental practice activities, to frame a sequence of contemplative practice activities, and also that it has a whole mapping out of virtues, which is really wonderful. That just to focus on the space of virtues, to tie. I mean, in the integral community, we talk a lot about values, but to really ground it in virtues is I think a really nice contribution. Trish, did anything come to mind for you to add at this point in terms of a big picture of IPP?
One thing I can say from my experience in the Down Under community as well is the secular encounter, I guess, as well. So, not even necessarily connected to lineage, in that sort of a way, there's a process that seems to emerge through engagement with IPP. And that makes me really curious, I guess, as well. So I love this idea that it's connected, that we've got the meta-lineage view, but it seems like there's something even inside which supports this encounter with the virtues that you were describing there, Tom, kind of thing as well.
So we'll share, Matt, is it okay for me to share the map with folks that you sent the link to? Tom?
Yep.
Yeah. Actually, maybe just quickly, I'll do a screen share of that thing right now. So it's on this video. Let's see if I can get that working. Here it is. Let's see.
I've got it tattooed on my forearm, so I don't need the screen share. For others, yeah. It's helpful.
Yeah, good. So this is so for each of the levels, and you guys are using the names of the levels from the stages model, from 0.5, 0. So it goes from 1.0, 1.5 on up to 6.5 and the usual stages model, and you've also got some at the bottom. And let me see. Yep. Okay. So you top out at 6.5 like Terry does. And we have columns here for the consciousness or energy, the primary polarity that's being worked out in that developmental level, the still point, and the virtues of doing and the virtues of becoming. We've got a little picture of that to share with people, and we'll put a link somewhere so people can find that. Yeah, and we will see, as I guess as the call goes on, how much we will dive into the actual details of those levels or not. But first, I thought I would reflect on the relationship between IPP and Terry's stages model, and sort of historically how they have been in dialogue and grown together.
Well, maybe I had developed the essence of the practice when I first encountered Suzanne Cook-Greuter, and Bina Sharma introduced us. And at that time, I became more fully aware of the depths of ego development theory. And through Suzanne, I became acquainted with Terry, and she was really formalizing the stages model at that time. And I just instinctively developed a deep alignment with her because we just seem to have very similar sensibilities of the deep interpenetrating connections of states and stages and themes and patterns. And I had the opportunity to, along with Terry and two of her colleagues, to do sort of the first scoring testing of the stages model. And we've just had such interface in the last decade that I kind of lose track of where IPP started versus what stages is. I mean, there's a deep interconnection there, and not that IPP purports to represent all of the wisdom and detailed stages, but I'm not aware of anything that isn't well aligned with stages. Probably the most important aspect of that was that I had already begun to align the stages that I was working with Suzanne's model, and then saw in Terry's in the stages model an opportunity to create polarity dynamics with a little bit more granularity into the meta tier. And so all of the polarities I work with initially were deeply validated by Suzanne and have been further fine-tuned and validated, and particularly further into the meta tier territory with Terry through the stages model.
Great. You want to add anything, Tom?
That about covers it for the moment. That's good.
Yeah. So yeah, that's just kind of about the historical interweaving of the two models. So I'm trying to think of how much we want to get into the nitty gritty. I do expect that some of this call will be a bit technical or nerdy for the average listener who's not familiar with these models, but because that's what I'm interested in is some of the nerdy questions. So I know we're going to get there. Let me try to give a stab at describing IPP, and if you guys promise not to laugh, I will do that as a way to kind of, and then throw it back to you to correct it. And then I do want to talk about kind of specific similarities and differences with the stages model. So for me, the IPP model traces development up through pretty much the same description of stages that Terry uses in her model, which again are, for the most part, quite similar to how Cook-Greuter and Loevinger describe ego development. And in IPP, every level is characterized by a primary polarity that people are working with, understanding, that I guess defines that territory. And in the process of doing the IPP practice, it's it's a voice dialogue practice. That's sort of it builds upon the big mind process, and so it gets people into a contemplation and a bit of dialogue about the nature of these polarities. And what John and Tom do in leading these is they have people. So, like, one of the polarities might be individuality and communion. What's the actual name of that one?
Agency and communion.
Agency and communion.
Version of individual and collective. It's agency and communion.
Yeah, so that's kind of the highlighted theme at one of the levels, and so they have the practitioner contemplating each of those kind of separately, and then go through a process of working with how they relate to each other, and then starting to see more and more how they sort of dance with each other, and then how they are actually two sides of the same coin in a way that the two concepts kind of merge into a single understanding of some phenomena. And then John usually uses there's a felt sense or state experience that happens with this same process that's used at each level, where you guys seem to work people into a state experience that you call a still point, where the two things come together. And all I can say from my description, it sounds kind of conceptual, like you're working with these ideas, but it's like this full-bodied experience of these ideas coming together in a kind of way that shows their fullness and their emptiness at the same time. And then you use that state to kind of pop into some new territory from that place. So that's my quick introduction to that. And then that's kind of a process that works with a single polarity, and you can use that process for any of the 12 or 14 levels that you've defined, and they each have their own unique characteristic. So go ahead and add to that, deconstruct it however you would, you guys.
Well, I think that was a nice initial introduction, Tom. That still point, for those who are familiar with this territory, is sort of a causal state, and the dance of the polarities, where they lose their concreteness, is sort of their subtle manifestation. Poles themselves are the concreteness of it. And then there's a non-dual practice in 3 different dimensions, where when they come together as one, where that still point has sort of a fullness aspect to it and an emptiness aspect to it. That's like a causal polarity that can be worked with to create a non-dual state. And then you have a witnessing aspect, where you witness all of this happening and allow the witness to collapse into what's witnessed. And so that's a little bit of a rarefied approach to the practice that a smaller group of people and a later teaching that I do. It's interesting because the inspiration for the whole practice did come out of the big mind teaching of Genpo Roshi with the voice dialogue and all, which was all about the non-dual or big mind. But nevertheless, it's been contextualized in a developmental setting, and so appreciate that gift of that original teaching and transmission, you might call it, that I received from Genpo Roshi. Out of that still point flow the virtues. Since that agency and that sense of deep trust in something absolute, whether it's God or the divine or your higher self, that automatically generates a sense of hopefulness, It sources a deep, unqualified, unlimited sense of love. And so these virtues are, what does the quality of this relationship polarity result in if you get through beyond one's ego self to one's deeper source? And so each one of those still point names is customized for that particular polarity to bring it to a still point, so that paradoxically, you can more fully engage with the aspects of relationship with yourself and with others. And so there's always a paradox that it seems like you're shutting down the whole purpose of the polarity, but what it does is enable you to come and engage with it in a non-egoic and more virtuous way. That's
John,
a couple of complementary thoughts.
John, maybe just for the listeners, say just another word about the paradox of seemingly shutting down the whole function of the polarity, just so that doesn't slip by.
Yeah, so for instance, if you come from a place of complete trust, that's a difficult place to be in, because we spend our whole lives learning what not to trust and how to have judgment about that. But if you allow yourself to go into that place of trust in something absolute, whatever source that is, you find yourself being much clearer about what you can trust, and you are much freer to be present and embrace relationship and see in the moment more clearly what there is to trust or not trust, rather than relying on feedback loops of your belief system or your life experience, but can be totally present with that. And at the same time, it just unlocks your ability to not be caught up in all of your ego defenses and ego needs, but to come from a more generous and abundant place in your relationships, internal and with others.
Tom, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's something you said earlier that I want to expound on a little bit when you described IPP as being a practice based in voice dialogue. That is true. We've worked with IPP via voice dialogue extensively, but it's also important to keep in mind that we refer to IPP as a life and awareness practice. So the awareness practice involves meditative awareness, which you pointed to, and voice dialogue, in some ways being a unique tool that allows us to access the energies, the realities more deeply within the different polarities. But I would say that another really important aspect of IPP that is fun and it's expanding, and we'll be working on this and map making for centuries to come, I hope. But it's the insights that the IPP map gives us into life practices that help exercise our being, creating a healthy ecosystem in a relative way, which allows us to open up beyond the ego. For example, when we're talking about agency and communion, this is actually a personal, real life example from my life. But my marriage counselor has pointed out that I have a dynamic of really loving my alone time in relationship. So I prefer the agency side of that particular polarity, and suggested that there would be a lot of growth involved if I allowed myself to, quote, feel more smothered by my partner. Because when I really, in a real life situation, when I start to live into the communion side of the polarity, especially in very vulnerable and intimate relationships, there's something in me that like a governor switch that kind of flips and says, I need to be alone now. And so that's a very, maybe too vivid an example of my own life. But the idea being, rather than just meditating and doing voice dialogue, we can use this to get insight into how much of one particular pole or energy would be medicinal or corrective for an individual. In other words, if I can become more friendly with the communion side of this particular polarity, it will also deepen my agency, allow me to live into that polarity in a more healthy way, and gain more powerful access to the still point. To the extent that we're really polarized and identifying too much with any one side of a pole, it's difficult to bring that energy into a stillness, the still point, which, you know, getting into what John said, allows us to show up in a more like beginner's mind way, spontaneously, and, you know, doing what the situation calls for. In other words, in my marriage, if I'm not in the still point, I'll retreat to my man cave to read books and to write. But if I really let more of that communion side of the polarity in, then it allows me, it creates more of a balance and a health in that polarity. It gives me more access to that still center, which is really the heart and the intention of the IPP practice, to help us cultivate that deep stillness and center. So just endless life practices, and we see them across all of the stages. And as a coach now and a group facilitator, I get a really quick embodied sense of when a room is imbalanced and it needs a little more of this. When I'm sitting one-on-one with a client, I get a pretty quick sense of which poles are a little imbalanced and what practices might help people exercise the polarity in a more healthy way.
I wanted to just make it explicit without getting into the details that the virtue of trust in some way, in some really wonderful way that John allows us to see, so beautifully captures the resolution of the paradox of agency and communion, and allows one to, you know, sort of deeply explore that whole spectrum. So there's all the way up through all the levels with these different polarities, the still points and the virtues are just a kind of a magical outcome of the whole world of each polarity. I wonder if one of you guys could just...
Can I maybe just expand a little bit on another dimension that's involved in all the polarities that I could talk about, specifically in agency and communion? I tend to try to find a still point that's associated with something pretty foundational, concrete, that a child could achieve, something that's a more causal manifestation of a causal still point, and something that's more of a causal manifestation of a causal still point. So for instance, the trust is really basic, is a child can get that and they can connect with that. And in a way, in this relational environment, it's sort of the third person. I trust that, I trust the absolute, I trust the divine. Then there's a second person where I commune with the absolute, I commune with the divine. And then there's an actual elimination of any separation, a union or oneness with the divine. And so it provides a practice opportunity related to mysticism in a tradition that holds a deity or a source of the divine, or a source that could be conceived as separate from the self. Because this is a relational polarity, it creates a relational practice through this third, second, first person relationships to help one engage experientially and, in a sense, mystically in that worship context.
Yeah, so you're taking the, Wilber's idea of the first, second, and third person faces of God, or whatever he calls that, and you're actually mapping that out to the entire developmental spectrum. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, and so point is always a place of beingness. In a sense, it's a portal to access your deepest wisdom and compassion and intuition in a sense, and so through the whole spectrum of one's being, one can find a divine aspect of that, a beautiful source of wisdom that comes uniquely through that portal related to that aspect of yourself. And so it's also very honoring and embracing of the full spectrum of the self and full spectrum of all humanity in a sense too.
Just to give people a little fuller sense of the whole, the scope of the map, wondering maybe Tom, could you pick another one of your favorite polarities and give us a kind of a quick rundown of that one. Now the agency and communion polarity is associated with which developmental level?
1.0.
Well, in the sense that the concrete version of that would be me and you. And so, so it's introduced in a subtle framing of agency and communion. So there's a concrete, subtle, and causal manifestation of each of those polarities. But nevertheless, it's you can't have a sense of agency or self without a sense of something other than yourself. And so that's really, it comes up at 1.0. And so the whole point is that you, as you continue to grow, you re-embrace and engage with that polarity from your highest awareness. And so once a polarity comes online, it continues to be transformed in a deeper source of that particular wisdom and functionality. I'm sorry, Tom, I got carried away there.
No big deal. Tom or Trish, do you want to comment on that, or same question applies, or just checking in?
One thing I guess I've noticed in the community practice was that even if we're in what seems to be quite a concrete polarity, like the 1.0 is, and Terry's model actually starts from 1.0, which is an interesting distinction as well. I'm really curious about the emergence of the two earlier polarities in there. But even if we're at 1.0, we still end up, that if I think about what participants report back for the Down Under community, it's experiences of openness, spaciousness. It's more in the realm of the kind of words that we see in the more causal or the meta tier kind of thing as well. So really appreciating the sort of broadening out of, the polarity has the gross, subtle and causal manifestations within it. Even at 1.0, we're already kind of reaching into causal in a way as well.
Yeah, Tom.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was inviting Tom or either of you to just give us a quick intro to one of the other levels, maybe one that was favorite one for you to facilitate, just so we get a little sense of. So that was 1.0.
Please go ahead with whatever you're inspired to share.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're all so rich to work with. My experience sharing polarity practice with individuals and groups is that the polarities at the concrete tier tend to be very juicy and information rich, to the extent that so much of our foundational development starts in the concrete tier and world. Most of our shadow tends to be kind of deposited in the concrete tier. So any concrete polarity you work with, I find that they just continue to offer insight and expansion, over years and decades. So, to that extent, another one, like just right after agency communion and IPP, is control submission, which, is the polarity of power and power dynamics, 1.5 Ontario-Fallon system. And, like I said earlier, we can work meditatively with these. To voice dialogue, is the voice of control, submission, the voice that transcends and includes both control and submission. the still point of peace, which represents the field of possibility that radically includes both control and submission. That's a really powerful practice. And just simple, straight up life practices are really powerful in this area. I might live to regret this when I hear this recording, but for whatever reason, the examples that keep coming up are coming from my marriage. But my wife and I have this joke where, you know, like, again, submission comes a little less readily to me. So we have this kind of practice where she's like, okay, I'm going to boss you around for the next hour. I'm going to tell you what to do. And you're going to like feel how uncomfortable it is to just submit. Right? And it's so practical. And, you know, maybe others of us are really quick to submit, and it's much more difficult. It turns out that it's more difficult for my wife to really, you know, stand her ground and say, this is what I want. This is what I need you to do. And so, you know, from a very young age, from early on in life, we learn to really favor certain qualities and energies. That's how we win love and affection and belonging in our family systems. We feel a lot of discomfort and intensity in the body when we get too far towards another pole. So as adults, we can gauge partners, friends, communities, and saying like, hey, I need more experience submitting. How can we design this into our friendship, our relationship? Well, you know, go get me a latte, Tom. You know, we start to welcome that energy in again. And as we befriend both energies, control, submission, lo and behold, I start to access this quality of peace more readily, where I'm willing to control. I'm willing to submit. I know how to do it. I've trained my body mind to do it again and again and again. I've created new pathways. And that opens up, you know, all sorts of, you know, new awareness and creativity. So that's a really fun polarity to work with.
Thank you.
Also, just an example from that polarity is in this field of power, also just to mention that just like in stages, these polarities come in pairs, is agency communion opens up the relational dynamic. And there's inevitably a power dynamic in any relational setting. And so that creates the structure of hierarchy and power that naturally comes with it. But in any event, the virtues that come out of complete peace are humility and gentleness, which are sort of the opposite qualities of where human nature would lead one when one has power. And so the virtues tend to be striking in the sense that they seem counterintuitive from the way a person would normally act if they have power, and yet it's the virtuous and appropriate way in any power dynamic to be in the world and do in the world, is to become more humble and to be gentle in the field of power.
Yeah, and I can feel into how much power a person has if they are living from a place of deep peace and humility. You really have tremendous power. Yeah.
And it's also interesting, the exciting thing when you're doing voice dialogue, because it's easy with the group and everybody can sort of hear, is how powerful the voice of submission begins to manifest. It has its own power and its own possibility and its own gifts in that regard, as well as its own pathologies, just as control does. But
I was curious about that, John, in terms of the emergence of the virtues and whether, because one thing I can appreciate from the group participation is where you were talking before about deepening into one of the polarities, going to the absolute, say, of trust to find distrust and be able to more fully access that. Whether the virtues had emerged from the voice dialogue process, because in what Tom was talking about in terms of the going into a particular life practice within his marriage, participating in a community, I find, brings me to an awareness of what's lacking in my own experience, kind of thing as well. It's like, something new becomes visible because I've heard it from somebody else. And so I was curious whether the virtues emerged from like collective engagement, or was it more a function of drawing on wisdom tradition teachings and that sort of thing?
Well, primarily they emerged from intuition. What I could sense would emerge in terms of how I was feeling like I was becoming, how my actions would be. And then in the context of working with groups, get feedback in terms of what other people were experiencing. So for the most part, it was individual and collective experience that manifested these virtues. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the virtues that arise out of the first, 6 or so polarities, they pretty much match the classic virtues, but they also pretty much match the positive principles. And if you go up to about the 8th level, and so I think one of the thrills of the practice is personally or collectively experiencing universal wisdom that just tends to arise in the field when you connect into archetypal universal qualities that all people have access to. And one of the humbling elements of it is you realize you're not inventing anything. It's just another way of accessing what's has manifested in so many beautiful ways in all sorts of traditions and philosophies already. But nevertheless, it's a practice framework for generating and reinforcing and deepening one's sense of how to be in the world from a deep, peaceful place.
There's something implicit here that it feels worth noting. A good map goes a long way. Like to your point, Trish and John, what you're sharing here, what I've found to be so valuable about IPP over the years is, by making these dynamics visible, control, submission, still point, peace, flows out into the virtue of meekness, gentleness. When I have a basic understanding of the territory via the map, I've found in my personal practice and in facilitation, we're more likely to notice and detect even the most subtle signs of humility arising. So we can notice it. And when we notice the virtues, we deepen the virtues, right? There's something about the map itself that primes our consciousness to be aware of, like you said, John, of what's already here. We haven't invented anything, but I think what we have is a really skillfully made map that enhances our capacity to sense in to the fullness of these, qualities that we see across the developmental spectrum.
One thing from a practice standpoint is everybody finds different blocks and different challenges in accessing various aspects of a polarity. But for instance, for a person who has a really hard time accessing a deep sense of peace, if you practice the virtues help you access the still point. If you practice the still point, that helps you access the virtues. So they're mutually reinforcing, particularly helpful if one is having a difficult time with any of that triumvirate of qualities.
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple things here. If you dive kind of the next level of detail into the IPP map, it also has a mapping of vices and pathologies, which is probably very useful from a therapeutic perspective and other perspectives, which you can also get, I imagine, as Tom was saying, you can start to pick up the subtle manifestations of these pathologies and vices more quickly. And so you kind of might have a sense of what the antidote might be. The other thing I wanted to say, just to kind of contradict the degree of humility with which John presented the model as just kind of a rediscovery of these, you know, what is in the traditions. And it certainly reminds me of, like, you know, the Buddhist treatment of virtues and vices and so forth. That's all those 7 factors and 8 factors and all of that that's in there. Tom, I'm sure you could tell us exactly what those are. But I think the really, truly an innovation here is to take that ancient wisdom, which tends to present all these things just kind of as a bag of virtues or vices or whatever, and to map the developmental lens onto them, which is, you know, a modern discovery, most of us think, in the integral community, which gives that amorphous bag some really interesting structural relationships between all of these things. So I think that's really an important contribution.
Well,
interesting.
I don't know if this would be consistent throughout, but a good friend of mine is a retired professor of internal medicine, who was one of the founders in academic medicine of mind-body medicine as a subspecialty of internal medicine. And he's been engaged in so many studies of human resilience. And with a number of colleagues, they collected dozens and dozens of studies of human resilience, and said, based on all of the way they measure things, there were 5 highest leverage principles of human resilience. If you live those and emphasize those in your life, you were in really good shape. It wasn't clear you need to worry about anything else in terms of what their science is all about. And all of those 5 principles of human resilience are embedded in the agency communion polarity, except that what they totally miss is the still point. And so they just have them as a list, but here's a practice piece around resilient science, as well as it seems to help provide a practice piece or a relationship piece from some of the traditions and listings of virtues. So anyway.
That's great. So I want to ask, what are I think we've talked about a lot of the similarities with the stages model, and I want to ask if there are any differences that you want to highlight. Yeah, either divergences or just places that the stages model doesn't really cover. I mean, the stages model doesn't really talk about virtues as explicitly. And I don't know if there are differences, what happens at the higher levels for you. But one thing I want to ask about is, in the IPP framework, it seems as like each level kind of emerges from working with the polarity at a given level. Maybe the next level kind of builds on top of that and emerges from it. And in the stages model, Terry has this framework of the four phases of receptive, active, reciprocal, interpenetrative that repeat in each of the 3 tiers. So that's a little bit of a different kind of structural model, you know, and she uses the active passive shift, with the receptive and reciprocal being more kind of passive, and the active and interpenetrative being more kind of active. So she uses that model as kind of the driving functions that make one stage emerge after the other. And you seem to have a slightly different take on that, kind of what the driving are
Well, let me say this. Say, for instance, for the 3.5 achiever level, the separation of poles, subject and object, there's an optimal separation at that point. When that first comes online, you experience it as an either or. So it follows, and the stages model would say at 3.5, you are using either or approaches to polarities or to options. And so when we introduce that for a person at 3.5, that's the first time that they can access that polarity as deeply as they do. They experience it as an either or. And so where first polarity comes up, it depends if you are the first, second, third, or fourth stage of a tier. The way you first experience that polarity will be symptomatic of what stages would predict. You experience it as being invested in one pole or either or both and or whatnot. And then as you have experience with that polarity, say at 4.0, I can experience, and I always sort of deconstruct the solidity of the pole. So it's subjectification and objectification. At 3.5, it's either subjectification or objectification. And really, it's subject and object. You can't deconstruct that. But when you hold that pole at 4.0, you can sort of hold them together. And at 4.5, they begin to interpenetrate. And it's really not until you get to 5.0 or 5.5 that they become a unity. And so wherever you start, you're going to experience a subtle polarity in terms of the projected dynamics of stages, either stuck in one pole or either or both and or integrated. And so, for instance, at 4.5, subjectification, objectification are integrated, and you really don't experience that as a unity probably till you get to 5.5. So the practice has a dynamic in it to take you to any subtle polarity to 4.5, and then to further work with it, it'll draw you in terms of the unifying aspect of it into the meta tier. So I completely responsive, but I did want to say that by being conscious of the patterns that stages provides, it helped me be aware that actually that's how people tend to experience them, and that you can't access some subtle polarities until you get up to that subtle stage of development. When you are able to experience it, you experience it in the way at your center of gravity. Generally speaking, some people are a little bit more advanced or further behind in terms of how they experience a particular polarity, but on the average that tends to happen. So I think as just an example of where IPP has been the beneficiary of experientially validating some of the patterns that stages predicts and says that's how it shows up through the data. I don't know, Tom, if you would disagree with any of that or would want to add to any of that. But.
No, I wouldn't disagree with any of it, but I have a bit of a synthesizing comment coming up that I think weaves in with the rest of our conversation to this point. Stages predicts that somebody from a 4.5 stage of consciousness will be able to work with polarity in an interpenetrative way, to see the one in the other, to see the subjectivity in so-called objectivity, and the objectivity and subjectivity, etc. But like from the perspective of the whole human being, somebody who has a fresh stages score and says they're 4.5, that doesn't mean that they have exercised that interpenetrative awareness all the way down through the spectrum they've grown up through. So back to control and submission, I'm, exhibit A. I got work to do in terms of deeply appreciating in an embodied way, moment to moment in life, that submission is a powerful expression of control and vice versa. So yes, to everything John said about stages and IPP reflecting that wisdom, but I would also just add that the opportunity we have when these developmental dynamics become visible is to say, okay, I have a stages score of 4.0. I can appreciate reciprocity, but like in a concrete way, does that mean I really see how agency supports deeper communion in my relationships? Can I see how greater control leads to the capacity to be more submissive and eventually meek and gentle? So, you know, to put this into practice is really a lifelong endeavor and a cultivation of virtue, like we've been saying. I just want to add that little piece. I would say there's a bit of a simplistic or diagrammatic notion we have sometimes in the integral community, like, oh, 4.5, you know, protocol says 4.5. That doesn't mean we've even begun to really distribute that 4.5 consciousness throughout the whole spectrum of being. And when we do that, when we really grow down and fill out in a healthy way, what I've seen working with people is that, you know, later stages tend to more easily emerge with greater health. So it's something we pay a lot of attention to in our community work.
Yeah, one of the frustrations in how I share IPP is I spend a year or two with people on fairly foundational stages, and they say, well, let's get up here, you know. But to me, just recognizing the patterns in the foundational elements and realizing that everything below your center of gravity creates a therapeutic opportunity, and that's more important really than growing quickly without being fully integrated throughout your being. But nevertheless, I think it lays the groundwork for then a healthier emergence. And because there are polarities that are always going to be one or two stages above where your center of gravity tends to be, you know, there are practice opportunities for stretching, as well as therapeutic opportunities for becoming more fully integrated and healthy in the whole context of yourself.
Great. Anything coming up for you, Trish, as this moment?
I always got curiosities. I was kind of curious because one of the things I actually really appreciated in a recent conversation with yourself, Tom Murray, was the insight that Terry's model, the stages model, in some ways draws on a sense of habituation to particularly the states kind of thing as well, like becoming aware of and available within gross, subtle and causal phenomena in a way. I was kind of curious about when it's a voice dialogue process, there's kind of a group center of gravity that I can imagine could be seen across groups as well. I was kind of curious about when it's a collective practice, what might become available that as an individual practice is not as available, if that makes sense.
Well, Tom has so much more experience than I do in group practice. And by the way, I'm taking like a 2-year sabbatical from really sharing IPP myself much because of a huge project I'm involved in. But before turning it over to Tom, I would say that myself, I never, in a group voice dialogue session, I never ceased to find really interesting and fascinating ways that a particular voice will speak up from a particular polar field that helps open a door to something that I hadn't seen before. And for people who have a shadow and can't access something, to hear others speaking authentically from that place. But just generally, the richness of the variety and yet the thematic consistency, it's very enriching But speaking about, a session, a couple of hour session with some people, not so much as a community practice. And for some perspective or wisdom around that, I'll defer to Tom.
Well, I'm curious, Trish, if your comment was pointing to habitual states within a collective, or stages, or both. For starters, yeah. I mean, one thing came to mind that I think I want to speak to, but I want to make sure I've kind of understood the prompt before I just launch into it.
Well, it's the thing about Terry's model, I guess, in a way that's different from the integral model in terms of the Wilbeck-Coombs lattice distinction between states and stages. And with Terry's model, we get this opportunity to kind of reintegrate them. So it could be either.
Yeah, no, cool.
Yeah.
Fair. Yeah, that's helpful. This could be its own like serial podcast to just explore this question, but I'll keep it to this podcast. I mean, one of the most obvious kind of experiences and examples that comes to mind is just the role of facilitator in IPP, of inducing a causal state in the collective. John does this better than anyone I've ever seen, to just hold a causal space from whatever particular polarity and whatever the center of gravity of the collective is, whatever their individual stages of development, their meditative background. I've seen John just hold a still point in the room and feel the field effect of that facilitation, and inducing a whole room into causal awareness. It's as if it allows a rigid and kind of structured personality system to kind of soften and mollify, so that shadows can come up and be expressed, or virtues can come up, higher awarenesses and wisdom can all just start to whip around in the field. So, that would be a really rich place to start the conversation. And it's a practice I hope other people will take interest in over time, just learning to facilitate IPP and realizing that the tail can very much wag a large dog. One person can just invite hundreds of people in a room into a causal state, even if those individuals would have a very difficult time holding a causal state on their own. So we see an amplified field effect in IPP facilitation that I find is very valuable, just to be a part of that. And similar to what John was saying, I'm always stunned by the awareness and the wisdom and the perspectives that just start to, kind of spout out of that field when people drop in. So.
Well, one thing I would say, Tom, getting back to your question, what are some of the differences between stages and IPP? I mean, for instance, in the construct aware, the 5.0 polarity is language meaning and empty language. In other words, it's a fullness, emptiness, causal polarity. Basically, that's it. I mean, there's some virtues that flow out of it, but there's so much more in terms of the data and the learning of stages about what are the qualities and characteristics of of that stage of development. And that's the same thing throughout. There's rich contextual knowledge and whatnot. And this is a very, in essence, it sounds complicated, but in essence, it's one primary polarity. I've tried to come up with maybe the most important archetypal polarity. I'm not ever sure that that's exactly it. It's one of several possible polarities that are very potent at a particular level. And it's all about that polarity and a lot of things that flow from it. I think we've talked about the richness of that, but I think the research and the wisdom and the patterns and so many multidimensional things that come from stages to inform what a particular what manifests at a particular stage of development, or begins to manifest, or what you move into and then move out of. There's a huge amount of richness and texture and wisdom and research there that I continue to be surprised by how we pick many aspects of that. But this is a practice that's pretty simple in a way and just tries to pick up a particular polar dynamic that's important to help unlock and enrich a particular stage of development. And the empty full polarity is only one of several polarities that you could pick up on that are relevant to that particular stage.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of, I know some of the early influences in IPP were from Suzanne's Cook-Reuter's theory, which of course stages is a sibling and in some ways builds on top of that model. But Suzanne and Bina Sharma are very very actively working polarities into their teachings lately. I don't know if that was happening back when you were engaging with it, but I always found it interesting that you developed your polarity model outside of or in parallel with the Barry Johnson polarity management system that so much informed Bina's and Suzanne's current their take on it. And what they do is I think they have like a set of different polarities for each level. So it's a different kind of system. They kind of look at how a stage manifests, and they come up with a few polarities that kind of come up at each level. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything about the relationship between the sort of either polarity management stuff or how Suzanne and Bina are working with polarities these days, and how that relates to what you guys are doing.
Yeah, I've I'm have a fair amount of exposure to polarity management, and have looked at Bina's latest teaching and whatnot, and I think both systems. I mean, Bina has the benefit of a developmental context and a richness that polarity management doesn't have. So it's sort of polarity management on steroids, but still it's basically a subtle practice of polarities. One of the things that I've noticed over the years, and Tom has really helped me with this, is that the way I tend to teach IPP, if you're not at 4.0, you usually don't come back. And we've learned that starting people with polarity management of the flow and how it works through the quadrants and whatnot is a very powerful introduction to just getting people acquainted with polarities, how to work with them, maybe up to sort of about a 4.5 sophistication capacity, and the very simplicity of bringing in the causal still point, and then all the dynamics that flow from that, and really the spiritual practice implications of that. And also just being able to grasp what it is and to feel like you can work with it rather than just hearing a bunch of words. And Tom has really led the way. And for instance, just in a recent retreat setting, your Spectra program in Lower Lights, I think you spent a good part of the day not in the first session with IPP, because I did that some months ago, but you spent most of the day working more in that subtle territory just to help people get more sensitized to this brilliant way that you can work with polarities and also feel into it so that you can then more authentically feel into IPP. But Tom, you probably have a better way of describing that and expressing that.
Well, what's an interesting direction to go in? I'd yield to the podcaster, the head podcaster of the conversation. Tom, is there anything you want to dive into? I got a great look on your face.
If something's coming up for you right now, Tom, that is definitely the best direction to go.
Okay, I'll just say, echoing John, I love Bina Sharma and Suzanne Cook-Reuter's work. I've learned so much from them. I try to read everything they write. And I also a great entry point to polarity management, to whatever we call it, integral thinking, post-formal cognition, all these different words to describe when we're getting into paradoxical thinking. It's powerful to enter within that subtle framework, but then the question becomes, like, when we start to move into causal awareness, whether that's a still point or a stage, you know, we realize the whole polarity is constructed, and therefore provisional. And how do we practice with polarity when the practice of polarity exhausts itself and there's no more polarity to work with? I think that's really been John's brilliance to introduce, you know, what makes integral polarity practice integral. One of the things is that in any given polarity, we're working with 1.0 agency communion. It's, yes, like, let's see agency, let's see communion, and then let's appreciate the reciprocity that there is agency in communion. In fact, healthy communion has a good amount of agency, and then the one is in the other, and so forth and so forth. But then we drop into that causal still point where the polarity is a unity now. It's formless, and we're showing up as beginner's mind, spontaneous mind. And that's a whole new world. And then, you know, a step further, when we really, you know, I'm waxing a bit metaphorical and poetic here, but when we disappear into the still point, as the still point, nature pours forth its virtue. And this is reflected in ancient wisdom systems like Taoism, where there's seminal text, the Tao Te Ching. The original characters, Tao Te, pointed to the phenomenon of a human being disappears into the Tao, becomes a flow of nature, Tao. And De, what flows out of the Tao, what flows out of nature, is non-egoic action or virtue. And so, you know, back to this fundamentalist foundational practice in IPP, we're cultivating virtue by cultivating selflessness. We cultivate selflessness by bringing polarities all the way up and down the spectrum into first healthy balance, but then spontaneous dynamic equilibrium, and then disappearing the polarity altogether and just showing up in the present moment and manifesting. So it's like polarity management on steroids, on steroids, on steroids. So it's really quite a contribution that I think John's made, and I've loved being in the practice of it for a long time now.
Yeah, and I love all the sort of fractal patterns that emerge. Yeah, you know, where the whole developmental spectrum is fractally embedded in each level, and in the transitions, and in different ways. And yeah, and as you've alluded to, it's a powerful tool for shadow work. And I think we all look forward to the time when, just not only with this practice, but with all of what all of our colleagues are developing, when we can move more and more into individual personal spiritual growth practice, into collective practices, collective shadow work, you know, group shadow work. That's extremely exciting territory. There are certainly people exploring that, and it's exciting to think how IPP could be, you know, is and could be more deeply incorporated into that level as well. Yeah, and I like this. Yeah.
I mean, there are a couple of kind of meta elements of IPP I could mention whenever you want to, in terms of describing some overall patterns of IPP, but this might not be the right time.
It is the right time.
So might be contributions to stages at some point. I mean, the first name I had for IPP was integral thematic practice, because what I picked up on was the thematic importance of concrete, subtle, causal, non-dual, and then the integrated expression. So that's five primary themes. And so you have 5 states in that regard. You have 4 tiers in their integrated expression. And you have the way I hold it and the way I share it, the stages carry those those themes throughout the tiers, and so the speaking of types, like the 5 Buddha families are essentially those five themes, and so there's this same 5 themes that show up in multiple dimensions, and so that talking about an interpenetration of states and stages in the thematic moment, they almost they deeply interpenetrate, and beyond your conscious ability to integrate all of these thematic dimensions, you are in an aesthetic of doing a jazz composition or a symphony of using these thematic chords, you might say. And I think stages implicitly has a lot of that. It just isn't so artful in how it expresses it. But I think that's the way I live it. That's the way I ultimately want to be able to teach it. But what I found after a couple of years is people had no clue what I was talking about. So I changed the name of the practice and haven't gotten back to teaching it since. But
I'm the sole survivor of ITP. Everyone else deserted. Everyone else abandoned ship.
Another meta theme for IPP is everything we've been talking about is called the ascending or evolutionary practice, where we bring polarities into a unity and create a field and all of that. But then coming from the non-dual into the manifest world in an involutionary current, rather than accessing the divine or the absolute, you are the divine or the absolute, and you descend in increasing multiplicity and embrace. And the difference of experiencing polarities that come from the prior unity is that whatever level anybody comes from, if you can get them there, they know that the other pole is inherent in the other. And so, for instance, if you move from the non-dual into transcendent wisdom, and then that goes down into transcendent compassion. For instance, there's a transcendent joy and a transcendent sorrow that are in the eyes of the world are the opposite. But if you're in that place, you can see that they're inherent in one another, and they're both grounded in love, and they're both grounded in compassion. And the greatest sorrow and descending beneath all things enables one to access the greatest joy, and vice versa. Sort of a metaphor of Christ, for instance, or to descend below all things is the way one experiences divine joy. And so there's a very potent practice, an involutionary practice, but I unless somebody has really well integrated, well developed containers, hold it, because it comes out without passion, with passion and without rules and without limits, it just flows, because that's the current. One has to have well developed containers to hold it, and if one is suffering from real shadow or doesn't have strong basic containers to hold it, I think there's some danger in the practice. But in any event, it's a important ultimate polarity that comes together as one, because the ascending and the descending, the involutionary and the evolutionary are always going on. And to be conscious of that, and just to have a meta practice that kind of holds that, and then a more granular practice with, I have a whole involutionary chart as well. Is another part of ultimately of how I'd like to share the practice, and I'm hoping in the years to come that I can really do the writing that I irresponsibly haven't done, but my great relief is that I have somebody, that is Tom, who really holds the wholeness of it, and whatever happens, he's he's going to carry it on in ways beyond my capacity. So.
It'll take me some time to fill those shoes.
Yeah, but it must be a lot of fun trying to fit your feet into them.
Yeah, totally.
Anyways.
Sometimes those shoes feel as big as the whole cosmos, Tom. Pretty roomy in there.
Well, I like the way that you invite us all in, Thomas. They are roomy the way you wear them. So that was beautiful, John. It's just that for me, I don't, without asking any specific questions about that space you just opened up, it just gives such a sweet taste of what it's like to work with you. You know, it's very inspiring. So where we've sort of played with this question, I want to bring it up specifically in case there's anything else to say about it. But the question is, how does IPP conceptualize states versus stages? And it's a question that's a little bit up. You know, it's an interesting theoretical question, in part because it might seem, at least on the surface, that Terry's version of this question is a little different than Ken Wilber's, in that Ken's got his Wilber-Combs matrix, which, you know, shows how any state can be experienced at any stage, but the way that you interpret that state is largely determined by the developmental stage that you're in. Whereas Terry is developing a theory that's slightly different, and it says that states are actually necessary but not sufficient conditions to enter into particular stages. So what does IPP have to say about that question, and is there any place that it's different than stages?
Well, so for instance, if you go to you know, the foundational polarity of physical expansion and contraction of you know, just breathing, for instance, you know, there's the concrete poles, there's the subtle flow, there's the causal still point of being, you know, deeply relaxed on the most basic level, or on more of a subtle level, being calm, or on a causal level of being tranquil. It's an example of where we have access to the concrete, the subtle, and the causal all of the time, because it's very foundational, and it's sort of structurally built in. And so the states have become structural elements of that anybody has access to. All of them is really those states. They're really structured. One of the definitions of states is you can only hold one at a time. And so there's such a deep integration of a certain quality of concrete, subtle, and causal, and even non-dual, that can be experienced with each one of these polarities at whatever level you're at, and yet there might be a certain requirement of a certain level of development to hold tranquility. They say, for instance, a child who can relax, and many adults can be very calm, but there might be spiritual attainment and also a structural attainment that you're really just not going to get to tranquility. And I'm not saying this in a very linear way, but I think that there's I think there's a rich textural way to talk about it in the way I've just been in terms of IPP, but the simplicity of it is I think it supports what Terry is saying, as opposed to the Wilbur-Combs matrix framework, which I think is a little more less organic and a little, you know, sort of a more rigid structure than the actual organic flow of things. And Tom, you could probably take it from there a little bit and speak a little bit more coherently about it.
Well, no, I love what you said. I'm just deciding if I want to pick a fight with O'Fallon or Wilbur in this particular Zoom call right now. I'll just echo a little bit what you've said. I focus less on the rarefied theoretical aspects of IPP and stages, and I hope to know enough about that to be skillful, but I'm really interested in how well these tools work with people in human communities. And yeah, my experience is that I don't know how meaningful it would be to say that a human being at a 1.0 center of gravity, who's, let's say, 3 years old, has access to, you know, like gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual states. I see the Wilbur-Combs matrix, for me, on the edges of it, it feels a little bit blurry, but the principle of it holds, you know, in terms of across the bulk of the spectrum of consciousness, it holds quite well. And, you know, whether 5-year-olds, you know, can enter a timeless, boundless space before they stably construct time and space, I leave that to the theoreticians.
Yeah,
Probably something that Trish and I will be working out in papers as we continue our nerdy adventures.
I
will be reading you two,
yeah,
faithfully.
But I mean, just to come at it from another way, you know, a person in the center of gravity in the subtle tier really doesn't have to have access to a causal state. They can be trained into it. And IPP is one practice that does that, but you can't move into the meta tier without stabilizing in the causal state, because it's foundational to the structure of the tier, to the foundation of the awareness. And I think that's an aspect of what Terry is saying, and its way of saying it is a little bit different than what the Wilbur matrix would.
Yeah. I think also Wilbur, you know, being so steeped in the Eastern traditions, his definition of states is, you know, from that framework of gross, subtle, causal, non-dual. And I think Terry expands that, you know, more in keeping in line with just cognitive psychology in general, to more, you know, state is just the state that your brain is in. And so she includes things like attention, focused attention, as a kind of state, which, you know, so, you know, I like that framework to just say that, you know, as adults, our ability to be in the state of focused attention is so natural, we don't see it as a state because it's a stage. But for a youngster who's developing that capacity, it appears as a state that comes and goes until it stabilizes into a stage. So she kind of works that concept, I think, through the levels, so that you can say that you know, what you just said about the prerequisites of entering the metaware or causal tier. For the subtle tier, there's also prerequisites such as focused attention and metacognition. Yeah.
And prerequisites in the concrete tier of sensing and meta-sensing that gives rise to the subtle tier capacities. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, with reference to the causal, I had a curiosity about that, because one thing the Wilbur-Combs matrix maybe wouldn't allow for was the actual downwards development in a way. John, you actually added to the stages the mind, life, and seeking, or the nothing, and then 0.0, and then 0.5. And in a way, if I think about mind, like that full awareness and empty awareness, and the way that one of the virtues in there, I think, is sacred light as well, how that actually connects back up, kind of thing as well. The Wilbur-Combs matrix itself in its structure doesn't actually facilitate that grounding in kind of to embodied experience that those earlier polarities, well, if earlier is the right word, but that those information-rich polarities seem to have available to them. I was kind of curious about how they emerged or where they came from.
You know, I can't even remember. You know, if you look at the Vedantic chakras, for instance, that they start prior to 1.0, and I just sort of tried to go back to physical functioning and sentience. There's a question of whether, for instance, the expansion and contraction should be first, because that's an exterior manifestation of the interior expansion and contraction that turns into consciousness. That's something we're in discussion with right now in terms of whether that should be flipped, for instance. But even though it's foundational even for plants and all animals to have that kind of organic movement, when one brings one highest awareness to it, you were touching into the ultimate, and so each of those, and I think that's where there's a little bit of flexibility, where you tend to get taught in some of the Wilbur classes about, this level is all about power and you've got to stay connected to this. Well, there are some dynamics there. They're about power, but they're not tied to where that first comes up. That's a quality of functionality and awareness that can continue to be informed. And I think all I'm trying to say in a very indirect way, Trish, is that, I really agree that bring one's highest awareness to that expansion and contraction, for instance, can provide some of the most profound meditative, spiritual, mystical experiences that one could have. And to me, that's one of the reasons I keep hanging out in the lower polarities, not only in teaching, but in my own practice, because the beautiful discoveries that continue to happen as you bring those currents down into the fullness of your being. I don't know if I was what you were saying, but that's what I gathered, maybe what you were getting at.
I wanted to add to that. What comes to mind for me is that Terry, sort of in following, the Lovinger tradition of ego development, it is very related to Bob Keegan's theories of meaning making. They're all about how we make a meaning, and they all start with language. So we have something that's supposed to be at the bottom called 1.0 in those models, but really that's the beginning of human meaning making and language. And if you're kind of following the developmental stack, beneath that is everything that we share with the mammal mammalian world, and then the whole animal world, and then the plant world, and you can go down to matter if you want to keep going down. So that's how I see, if you're taking that larger picture, those lower levels below 1.0 will naturally be needed, and they don't show up in Terry's model again, because it all started with Lovinger, who's looking at meaning making and ego per se, which animals don't have to deal with. Yeah, but I do know that Kim, and I want to make sure that Kim Barta's name is mentioned somewhere in this call, because he has been so important in helping Terry develop her theory and working with her in the last 5 or 8 years at least. And I know that you guys all talk and work together.
Well, we've had an opportunity together through the Lower Lights Spectra program that Tom has sponsored. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that so Kim has proposed that there is a 0.0 and a 0.5 level that's kind of similar to what you guys are talking about, and he might have been inspired by that work.
Yeah. But before we leave it, because I might forget, I'll just bring it up. My sense, and I don't know, and I haven't had the kind of conversations that I have or the analysis I should have, but I'm just talking from a place of belief and experience that that I think in the developmental field there's quite a bias that if, say, for instance, you're at 2.0 or 2.5, your wisdom is going to be pretty primitive, and there's always greater complexity and greater, you encompass more and more, and yet my experience is, and I think IPP would somewhat validate it, that there is children can access a causal still point and access profound wisdom and intuit things and know things that maybe will get expressed in kind of primitive terms and childlike terms, but that you should also be listening to children and picking up on. And it isn't simply that they're just curious and open, but I think there's a wisdom that can come from the full spectrum of humanity that's very powerful, that the developmental field tends to not fully appreciate, in my opinion. And I don't know that it's all that inherent in IPP, but that's sort of what I see and feel in the context of my practice and what I pick up on. Again, that's maybe just my own bias, but that might be where there's a difference that I would love to explore more methodically in years to come.
Great. It touches on some things that I'm also exploring, John, so someday I'd love to continue that conversation. I have an idea for next question, but I want to just open it up again for anybody else who's got something on the top. This might be more, we'll see if this is a question more that Tom will jump on first. So I'm thinking of the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist traditions, Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and I know, I think Trish, Tom, and I have had some exposure with Dan Brown's teachings, and so in some ways these levels kind of involutionarily drop down into deeper and deeper levels of the construction of self and reality, and the framework that he uses kind of points to, of course, there's a place where the ego is developed, and that's something that we then can, deconstruct and see through or create still points, or however you want to say it. But he also talks about the the very lowest level construction of time and space, boundaries themselves, and also just the bare differentiation between an interior and an exterior, and all those things are, kind of very early stages. And so I'm just curious about how some of that framework relates to IPP practice.
John, are you going to jump on this one?
No, I think he addressed it to you, Tom. So,
I have been kind of exploring Tibetan and Mahamudra the last couple of years, but don't feel I have a familiarity with it enough, as well as Dan Brown's work, to really do it justice or try to link it to IPP. I'd be curious, you, Trish, or Tom, if you continue along that line of thinking, just to hear more about it.
Trish?
One of the things, I guess, that I'd noticed particularly is in the practice with Dan, sticking very closely to the tradition in terms of the pathway that the tradition follows. I guess to get back to the experience of the point where ego is birthed, and then selflessness can kind of enter into the picture. I think one of the things today that I've really appreciated from today's conversation is the way that IPP makes possible an encounter with that, maybe from wherever you are, kind of thing, almost. So while the pointing out way has a particular pathway along which you'll walk, IPP lets you dip in wherever you are. I think that's a key takeaway I would take from today. And there's something about a group practice, I think, as well. One of the other things I was very aware of is the way that Suzanne and Beamer's work might speak to creating a sense of safety to go to the place of selflessness, because that's quite a key aspect, I think, of that state experience. And in integral community, we tend to take it a little bit for granted that folks who are in the community already experiencing the safety and can kind of stay to ground in a sort of presence in that sort of a way. So Dan's pathway there is quite linear. It takes you there in a safe way because you've walked the pathway. And IPP takes us there because we're in a shared group space, I guess, where entry into that point, which is, potentially not for the faint-hearted kind of thing in a way, becomes a shared experience, and then in a way, a safety emerges. If that sort of makes sense.
yeah, thank you. Tom, what about you, Tom Murray? Any thoughts, observations?
Well, my last question was going to be, I'll ask it, and then I'll answer it for myself. The last question is sort of musings on the future of IPP, its evolution, and its theoretical evolution, and its the practice. And I'll just jump in to say that what's really exciting about this whole space is how these spiritual teachings are combining with the developmental perspective, and that's then combining with the cognitive science of what happens in the brain and the psyche. So, for instance, we have this idea of that we're letting go of the ego, or that we're somehow getting beyond time and space in some of these states. And cognitive science is showing us, we already knew a lot of this from the spiritual traditions, but that actually there are many layers of building the ego. So they can actually draw out this whole spectrum, and the same for time and space and object boundaries. So there's a space that's opening up at this level of granularity of what actually builds on top of something else, and it's just an exciting space. You know, it starts to inform. You know, like for instance, I think the deeper you dig into this stack, the more powerful the insights and the releases become, but also the more you're playing with the deeper and deeper interiors of the mind, the foundations of the mind. So there's the fact that we can layer on this developmental map kind of answers a lot of these kind of questions about when and how should you deconstruct deeper and deeper layers of the self and the mind. And so I'm just excited about that. And yeah, so I'll ask you guys to either rip up at that or just say something in our final minutes here about the future of IPP.
Well, one thing I know for sure is I don't, I can say this more dramatically than Tom, I just don't have a lot of exposure to the Mahamudra tradition and Don Brown's teachings, and sounds, you know, extraordinarily rich, and I'd love to explore the interfaces and potential fertilization that IPP could receive from, you know, deeper wisdom in that regard. But I would say, you know, some of the real development that's come in IPP in recent years has come from the lower, the more foundational polarities, such as the mind polarity of open and focus. And one that we're playing right now is possibly a fourth pre 1.0 of in and out of the, you know, in the Wilbur matrix, there's sort of the little circle for the other primordial. And so it's really, is that already implicitly in the open focus, or is that something separate where you passively come in and you construct? It gives an opportunity for the constructing of all knowledge, and maybe the still point of not knowing, which is a key Zen perspective. And also, you know, I've been holding the polarities of a unified tier for several years. I'm not ready to share them because a lot of it's based on pattern projection, maybe some access. But also another thing I've noticed is that when we redo the chart every year and a half or so, and immediately we're adjusting a lot of things because it's really out of the experiential practice dynamic that we've gained the wisdom over the years to continue to fine tune and help, you know, that inductive, abductive, deductive cycle. We work with the experiential side primarily first, and so that's sort of an exciting way for an experiential practice to continue to evolve based on the wisdom of working with people.
I've got something riffy to add to that, Tom and John. It's now good. One of the futures I envision for IPP has to do with amplifying the polarities we're actually working with. We have high leverage thematic polarities, one to correspond to each stage. But I envision over time a kind of constellation or cloud of polarities, you know, that tend to, you know, gather in the field around a particular stage. And I could see that being very enriching. And along those same lines, practices that correspond to those polarities and those stages for example, we start at 0.0 in IPP, just the life polarity of expansion, contraction. And we know from people with traumatic organization can't deeply rest physiologically, right? Or maybe somebody not with trauma, but maybe just like low-grade anxiety, neurosis, that will prevent them from relaxing as deeply as they could. And there's a whole kind of protocol of different practices that different people will enjoy. So we can take care of the health of that most foundational polarity of life itself. And then, you know, do a little work with desire and aversion, 0.5. And it so happens that Buddhism is really adept at identifying this basic quality of equanimity and learning how to relax, push, pull, and struggle at some of the deepest levels of our being in order to arrive at a still point of, you know, contentment, where Buddhism would identify, you know, something like no self, right? And then, you know, moving up from there, we get back into agency and communion, and so on and so forth. So what I've noticed is that, you know, there's a kind of burgeoning spiritual marketplace nowadays, and people are into different practices, somatic modalities, meditation, therapies, etc. I envision IPP making visible the relationships between these different modalities, therapies, practices that we're drawn to. I have a better sense of, you know, just for diagnostics, like what aspect of my being feels like it's not as robust as it could be. And, you know, given the IPP library of practices we've found to be high leverage for working with different stages and polarities, that'd be a really tremendous resource for humanity as we build that out. So that's what I got.
Oh. Awesome. Trish, you have any final thoughts of the future?
I think it's just an echo or reflection kind of thing that I have about at that point, like to connect back to what you were saying, Tom Murray, there as well, about the sense of almost the polarity makes available a sense of what's released, kind of thing, and it'd be marvelous to then get to appreciate what John was describing in terms of if we start from unity and then reach into polarity, what was that actual like how that sort of happens, I guess, as well, but also then as well to touch into what Tom was saying as well, because I don't think that's wrong in terms of what we're witnessing is this emergence of different places where people find, oh, you know, I'm much more about body practices, or I'm much more about authentic relating practices, how they actually speak to each other, how that might be informed by this question of what are we releasing even as we integrate, kind of thing. That's a really rich exploration, I think. So I'm looking forward to it. I think is what I'm saying.
Well, you both are so kind to take this time and attention. I should certainly appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you both, and all three of you for spending this time. I'll just say that my vision of the future of IPP is the best thing I can imagine is just continuing to have opportunity to hang out with the three of you.
Agreed, wholeheartedly.
That'd be great.
And yeah, find ways to do good work together. So thanks so much to everybody.
Thank you.
Until we see each other again.
Yeah.
Okay.
So great to be with you all on this call. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.